A bear had been chained for years, and when it was finally freed, something incredible happened. Jack Whittaker had long since stopped counting the years he'd lived alone in the cabin nestled deep within the untouched wilderness of the American Northwest. It sat like a quiet sentinel amid towering pines and whispering winds, its walls worn by snow and time. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, and Jack liked it that way. Once a respected forest ranger, he had traded human voices for the hush of falling snow and the rustle of pine needles in the wind. People ask too many questions out here, nothing expected answers. His days passed in rhythm with the forest, chopping wood, fishing from the frozen stream, tracking the quiet movement of animals across snow-covered trails. Solitude suited him, or perhaps, after the things he'd seen, it was the only thing left that did. The night it began, the moon was half hidden behind a shroud of clouds. A brittle wind clawed through the trees, whistling through gaps in the logs of Jack's cabin. He sat by the fire, boots off, toes thawing beside the hearth, a cup of black coffee cooling on the side table. The dog-eared pages of a wilderness manual lay open on his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in a while. Outside, the forest groaned under the weight of winter, branches bowing low under fresh snow. Then came the sound, a cry, faint and drawn, rising above the sigh of wind like a question asked in pain. Jack stiffened. He knew the voices of the forest well, the screech of an owl, the howl of coyotes, the chatter of disturbed raccoons. But this was different. Lower, raw, mournful, and unmistakably unnatural. He rose without thinking, instincts older than memory kicking in. He grabbed his coat, laced his boots, slung his flashlight and his old ranger pack over his shoulder, and stepped out into the dark. The cold met him like a slap, but he welcomed it. It woke the senses. The sound had come from the northeast, somewhere past the frozen creek. He moved quickly but carefully, snow crunching under his boots, eyes scanning the trees. Every few minutes, he paused, listening. The cry came again, closer now, and more desperate. It pulled at something in him, not fear, not curiosity, something older, a memory of helping, of responding to suffering when no one else would. He passed under bent firs and skeletal birches, their trunks swaying like centuries in the wind. After nearly an hour of hiking, he came upon it. The old hunting lodge had long since fallen into ruin. Half the roof had collapsed, and its walls leaned with age. But what made Jack stop was what lay beside it. Chained to a rotting post, half hidden in the snow, was a bear, a massive one. Though ribs jutted through its matted fur and patches of blood stained its paws, it didn't growl or lunge. It barely moved. Its head turned slowly toward him, and in its dark eyes was not rage, but something that gripped Jack harder than fear ever could: resignation. The chain clinked softly as the bear shifted, revealing raw skin rubbed raw around its neck. Jack exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Someone had trapped this bear here, starved it, and left it to die in the cold. He knelt slowly, never looking away. "Easy now," he said, his voice barely louder than the wind. "Not here to hurt you." The bear didn't flinch. Its eyes tracked him, weary but not hostile. Jack opened his pack, pulling out the jerky he always carried. He slid a piece across the snow. The bear sniffed once, then slowly leaned forward and took it with trembling jaws. Jack didn't move closer. He sat. Minutes passed. Another piece of jerky. Another tentative bite. Then silence again. He stayed until the wind picked up, snow stinging his face, and finally stood. "I'll come back," he promised, and turned to head home. The next morning, he returned, this time with more food, water, and a crowbar. The bear was still there, still alive, though barely. Jack didn't rush over. Days, then weeks, passed. He made the trek, always the same ritual, slow approach, food offerings, quiet words. He brought blankets, a tarp for shelter, and cleaned the wounds when the bear allowed it. Somewhere in that time, he started calling him Bruno. It felt right, like naming a ghost to remind it was still real. Bruno never growled, never swiped, but neither did he move far, as if uncertain if he was really free. Jack examined the chain, rusted and tight, embedded in the post and likely deeper into the earth. One afternoon, after Bruno had eaten and curled slightly to sleep, Jack set to work. He hammered, he dug, he pulled until the muscles in his arms screamed. It took nearly an hour, but eventually, the chain's bolt cracked loose from the post. Bruno jerked awake, rising quickly but not toward Jack. His eyes locked on the loosened chain, then back to Jack. Jack dropped the crowbar and stepped back. "You're free now," he said quietly. "No one's holding you anymore." Bruno stood there, snow swirling around him, the chain dragging behind like a memory. For a moment, Jack thought the bear would flee, but Bruno didn't move. He simply stared, then gave a low rumbling breath, something between a sigh and a growl, and walked away into the trees. Jack didn't follow. That night, back at the cabin, Jack sat by the fire once more. The forest was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, not the emptiness he'd grown used to, but one filled with the echo of something profound. He didn't know if Bruno would make it through the winter. He didn't know who had left him chained or why. He didn't even know if he'd ever see him again. But for the first time in years, Jack felt the stirrings of connection, not just to the wild he had sworn to protect, but to something deeper, perhaps a bridge between the broken in him and the broken in the world. As snow began to fall again, Jack poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and watched the fire crackle. Somewhere out there, a bear walked free, and for now, that was enough. Winter deepened its grip on the forest with ruthless precision. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets that swallowed the world in white silence, muting even the wind's howl to a whisper. Jack Whittaker moved slower now, his breath visible in the cabin's kitchen as he boiled water over the wood stove. The small fire barely kept the cold at bay, and even with his experience, the frigid temperatures this season brought a kind of fatigue he hadn't felt in years. The world outside had become a glassy, frozen wasteland, and yet a part of Jack remained restless. His thoughts drifted back to the bear he'd freed. Since the day Bruno vanished into the trees, Jack had seen no sign of him, not a paw print, not a broken branch. He had told himself that was a good thing. Bears moved on. They survived. Maybe that was the whole point of setting something free, never knowing if it would come back. Still, every morning, he shoveled a narrow trail out to the tree line and left scraps, jerky, fish, sometimes berries from the freezer. Days passed, then weeks. The food remained untouched. Jack kept doing it anyway. Something about that quiet act brought him a strange peace, like he was keeping a promise no one had asked him to make. One evening, as the sky darkened into a heavy bruise of gray, snow began to fall harder than it had all season. The wind snapped through the trees, bending the tallest pines until they groaned. Jack braced the windows with boards and stacked extra firewood by the hearth. The storm was brutal, even by his standards. He layered blankets on the bed, brought the last of his supplies inside, and settled in for what he expected to be 2, maybe 3 days of being completely cut off. On the second night, as snow hammered against the roof like fists, Jack stirred from half-sleep to a noise barely audible over the storm. A thud, then another, heavy and uneven, like footsteps. His pulse quickened. He sat up slowly, listening, straining against the storm's roar. The knock came again, not a human knock, but a solid, weighty press against the cabin door. Jack moved cautiously, lighting the lantern and grabbing the iron poker by the fire, out of habit. As he opened the door a crack, a rush of freezing air and snow blasted in, forcing him to squint. At first, he saw nothing but the swirl of white. Then, just beyond the threshold, he saw the shape, massive, hunched. Snow clung to dark fur in clumps. The eyes were what gave it away, familiar, deep, and unblinking. Bruno. Jack opened the door fully, stunned. The bear stood in the storm, not moving, but breathing heavily. His fur was soaked, caked in ice. But it wasn't just him. Behind him, barely visible against the snow, were two smaller forms, cubs. Jack's heart jolted. They were young, too young to be alone in this weather. One had collapsed into the snow, unmoving. The other staggered, barely able to walk. Bruno turned his head, looked at Jack, then back at the cubs, then at Jack again. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't coincidence. He had come here for help. Jack didn't hesitate. He threw on his coat and boots, grabbed the emergency blankets and a canvas tarp, and stepped out into the storm. The wind was savage, stinging his skin like knives. He knelt beside the cubs, checking them. The smaller one had a shallow pulse. The other had a metal snare tangled around its hind leg, blood mixing with snow. Jack's jaw clenched. Traps. Old ones, probably left unchecked, forgotten until now. He moved fast, cutting the snare with pliers from his pocket, wrapping the cubs in blankets, then in the tarp. Bruno hovered close, low to the ground, as if trying not to frighten them. Jack didn't speak. There was no need. He understood the urgency in every movement, every breath. Carefully, he lifted the cubs, their weight awkward, but manageable. He turned back toward the cabin, trudging through knee-deep snow, Bruno trailing behind like a silent guardian. Inside, the fire was revived quickly. Jack laid the cubs near the hearth, rubbing their paws, drying their fur, whispering to them. He boiled water, added honey-soaked rags to feed them drops. Hours passed in a blur. One cub began to stir weakly. The other remained still, but its breathing steadied. Bruno sat just outside the cabin, watching through the window, his breath fogging the glass. Jack kept the door cracked open, letting the bear see his cubs were safe. He didn't try to bring Bruno in. He knew the bear wouldn't come, but the message was clear: this was sanctuary. Over the next few days, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, life slowly pushed back against death. The cubs regained some strength. The one with the wounded leg limped painfully but ate from Jack's hand. The smaller one curled close to the fire, eyes fluttering open, soft whimpers escaping its mouth. Jack tended to them with a careful mix of knowledge and instinct, the same way he had once treated injured fawns and lost wolf pups during his days as a ranger. Each time he stepped outside for firewood or water, he found Bruno still there, waiting near the tree line, pacing, watching. He never tried to come closer, never made a sound. He was trusting Jack again with something sacred. By the time the storm passed and the sun finally broke through a sky scrubbed clean of clouds, the cubs were well enough to walk. Bruno returned one morning to find them bundled in fur scraps by the door, alert, if still weak. Jack stepped aside as Bruno approached. The cubs, upon seeing him, let out soft, relieved sounds. Bruno sniffed them, nudged them, then turned his head to Jack. A long moment passed, no growl, no roar, just a stare filled with something deeper than animal instinct, understanding, gratitude. Then, without a sound, Bruno turned, his cubs following clumsily behind him, disappearing once more into the forest's embrace. Jack stood in the doorway for a long time after they vanished, the silence pressing around him, not empty, but full. He had seen wild animals before, helped them, watched them die, watched them heal, but nothing like this. This wasn't just chance or survival. This was something else. A bond, maybe. A thread woven between species, between lives. He didn't try to name it. He just felt it. That night, the stars shone so brightly it was as if the storm had scoured the sky clean. Jack sat outside, wrapped in a heavy coat, a cup of hot coffee in his hands. The woods were calm, peaceful. He knew he might never see Bruno again, or the cubs, but deep in his bones, he also knew this wasn't the end of the story. Not yet. Something had shifted, something bigger than just him or the bear. A door had opened, a line had been crossed, and somewhere out there, in the hush of the wilderness, that connection still breathed. By the time the first thaw came to the forest, word had already begun to ripple through the nearby town of Gurza's Hollow that Jack Whittaker, the long quiet forest man, had done something remarkable. Jack, as usual, hadn't intended to share anything. After the storm, after Bruno and the cubs vanished into the woods, he had returned to his quiet routines, checking animal tracks in the melting snow, fixing the porch roof, brewing coffee as the sunlight finally filtered through the canopy. But isolation had a way of cracking under the weight of extraordinary acts, and the people of Gur's Hollow had long considered Jack a mystery worth respecting. So when he'd appeared in town with 2 bear cubs swaddled in flannel, limping and barely breathing, and when he'd carried them through the doors of the veterinary clinic with eyes dark from sleepless nights but a quiet fire in his voice, something changed. Dr. Harris, the town's aging vet, had taken one look at the cubs and nearly dropped his stethoscope. He hadn't seen bear cubs up close in years, not like this. Jack stayed while the vet worked, feeding the cubs honey oats, his hands never far from their trembling frames. Word spread quickly. Emily Parker, the young schoolteacher with a fierce love for wildlife, heard about it first and told her students the next morning. A man and a bear helping each other through a storm, she said, and the tale landed in the classroom like a spark in dry grass. Children went home and told their parents, who told others. By the end of the week, Walter Green, owner of the general store, greeted Jack with an unexpected smile and a basket of supplies already wrapped. On the house, Walter said. For the cubs. Jack didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to kindness coming back to him. Years of solitude had hardened him to most of the world's noises, but the quiet gestures, those always got through. Tom Reynolds, a burly, weather-worn lumberjack with arms like tree trunks and a voice like gravel, stopped Jack on his way out of town. Heard about the bear, he said, offering a slow nod. You need help building something for him? I'm handy with an axe and not afraid of fur. Jack paused, looked Tom in the eye, and gave the smallest nod of thanks. That was how it began, not with headlines or broadcasts, but with hands and hammers and meals left at doorsteps. By spring, Jack had constructed a proper shelter just beyond the tree line. It wasn't a cage. He refused to call it anything close to that, but a reinforced open space where injured animals could rest, hidden from predators and shielded from storms. It started with a few birds, a limping fox, a deer with a broken leg. People began leaving notes at the cabin, wrapped around jars of food or tucked into baskets. "Found this owl in the ditch, thought you might know what to do." Jack never answered. He didn't need to. They knew the forest was changing, or perhaps people were remembering something they'd forgotten. One crisp morning in May, a sleek black car rolled into Gruza's Hollow, an anomaly in the dusty, rugged streets. Out stepped Claire Morgan, her boots still new, but her eyes sharp with curiosity, a journalist from a regional magazine. She had come following whispers of the man who had freed a bear, nursed its cubs, and now quietly cared for any creature the forest could spare. Claire wasn't the type to chase fairy tales, but something in the story pulled at her. She found Jack the next day, hauling logs behind the cabin, sleeves rolled, beard flecked with sawdust. He looked at her with the weary gaze of a man unaccustomed to being seen. "You're here to write something?" he asked. "Maybe," she replied, adjusting her recorder. "But mostly, I'm here to understand." It took time, but Jack eventually spoke. Not much, not about himself, but about the bear, the storm, the cubs. He didn't embellish, he didn't dramatize, he just told the truth as it happened, and somehow that made it all the more powerful. Claire stayed 2 nights in town, interviewing others, Emily, Walter, Tom. She watched Jack feed a red-tailed hawk with a wing set in splints. She saw the way he moved among the trees, like he belonged to them. When her article published, it was titled "The Man Who Freed a Bear." It went viral within days. Something about it, the quiet dignity, the rawness, the humility, resonated with people across the country. Donations began arriving almost immediately, packages, letters, checks for Jack, they said, for Bruno, for the forest. Environmental groups reached out, photographers asked for permission to visit, students from universities wrote essays. Jack turned most of it away. He didn't care for crowds, but he couldn't ignore the good that was coming from it. With help from the townspeople and materials funded by the sudden swell of generosity, they began to build something bigger. An official sanctuary, one that could house injured animals, educate children, and offer refuge for the forgotten. They called it Whitaker's Refuge. Jack didn't argue the name. It embarrassed him, but the cause didn't. If it meant more space, more safety for creatures like Bruno and his cubs, it was worth it. Volunteers came, some to work, some just to witness it. Emily helped design educational programs for school kids. Walter stocked supplies. Tom oversaw the construction of the outer enclosures. And Jack? Jack stayed in the background, fixing what broke, tending the wounded, always keeping one eye on the tree line. He still left food out, still watched the horizon. Bruno had not returned since that winter, but Jack felt his presence, tracks in the distance, a tree marked with old claw scratches, and once, at dusk, the low, distant rumble of a bear's breath in the pines. Claire returned months later, this time not as a journalist but as a friend. She brought her camera and a small plaque in honor of the bond between man and bear. Jack accepted it without a word, mounting it on the old stump near the cabin. That night, under a sky thick with stars, a small group gathered by the fire: Jack, Claire, Emily, Tom, and Walter. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The forest around them was alive with quiet sounds, rustling leaves, owl calls, the gentle murmur of wind. Somewhere far off, the wild continued. In time, Whitaker's Refuge became more than a sanctuary. It became a place where people remembered how to listen, where the line between man and nature blurred, not erased, but softened. And at the center of it, always, was the story, not just of a man and a bear, but of trust, of recognition, of a kind of ancient, silent promise kept through snow and hunger and fear. Jack never claimed to be a hero. He never claimed anything. But the world had seen what he did, and it hadn't forgotten. The years rolled forward like the seasons Jack had always lived by, unrushed, unbothered, inevitable. Whitaker's refuge continued to grow, its trails winding deeper into the forest, its name whispered with reverence by visitors who came not only to see animals but to feel something older than themselves. Schools sent children. Scientists conducted quiet studies. And people from across the country found excuses to wander beneath the trees Jack once called home. But Jack, as ever, remained near the edge of it all, not out of shyness, but because he had always belonged more to the wild than the world. He rarely left his cabin, except to walk the trails or check on the shelters nestled in the forest beyond the sanctuary's bounds. The staff had grown, young, bright-eyed conservationists full of purpose and fire, but Jack's presence was still the pulse of the place, steady and enduring, like a great oak in the center of a clearing. He never took a salary, he never gave speeches, he just showed up each morning, boots crunching over pine needles, coat worn thin, hands steady as ever. People spoke of him with the quiet respect usually reserved for monuments or mountains. Bruno had not returned, not fully. Over the years, there had been signs, a paw print in the mud by the stream, claw marks high on a tree, and once, just before dawn, the haunting echo of a bear's breath carried on the wind. Jack never chased these moments. He acknowledged them with a nod or a pause, as one might salute an old friend passing by on a distant road. The cubs, now full-grown bears themselves, had been spotted occasionally on the outskirts of the sanctuary, never staying long, always wild and free, just as Jack had hoped. He took comfort in that. He had saved them, and in doing so, had saved something in himself. The cabin grew quieter each winter. The forest around him aged, as did he. His hair, once the color of pine bark, had turned silver, and his gait had slowed. But his eyes lost none of their clarity. They still held the same fierce kindness that had stared into Bruno's the night he cut the chain. Some nights, Jack would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, wrapped in an old quilt Emily had gifted him, and watch the trees sway in the moonlight. He didn't feel lonely. The forest was alive with memories. They were in the wind, in the crackling fire, in the trail worn from his boots. The world had come to him in its own way, and still, deep down, he waited. One morning, Jack didn't come down the trail. The staff noticed first. His absence was like a missing note in a familiar song. Claire Morgan, who now split her time between the city and the refuge, was the one who hiked up to the cabin, snow crunching beneath her boots. She knocked, no answer. The fire inside had burned low, casting only embers. Jack was in his bed, quilt drawn to his chest, a small peaceful smile on his face. His hands were folded, a journal resting on the table nearby, its last entry dated the night before. There was no sign of struggle, no pain, just stillness. A man who had lived in harmony with life and had now returned to it as quietly and gently as he had always done. Word of Jack's passing moved through Gruza's hollow like wind through the trees, soft, sudden, and full of weight. The town gathered first, then the staff, then the strangers, the travelers who had read Claire's story, the conservationists inspired by his work, the people whose lives had shifted because of one man's quiet example. Emily organized the memorial. Tom built the wooden platform in the clearing. Walter provided hot cider and candles. The service was held beneath a sky streaked with late autumn clouds. No grand speeches were made. Instead, they shared stories of the first bear cubs, of Bruno, of Jack teaching a child how to identify trees by their bark, of him showing a terrified volunteer how to calm a frightened fox. Each voice added a layer to the man who had never asked to be remembered but had become unforgettable all the same. As the crowd began to drift away that evening, a hush fell over the sanctuary, thick and reverent. The wind picked up, stirring the trees, and then, as if summoned by memory itself, a shadow appeared at the edge of the woods, massive, familiar, covered in snow and silence. Bruno, older now, his fur graying around the snout, his gait slow but strong, stepped from the trees into the clearing, not rushed, not fearful. The people still present froze, watching, breath held, hearts thundering. Bruno made no sound. He approached the cabin, passing by the platform where Jack's photograph stood, and stopped near the front porch. There, he sat, lowered himself to the earth, and simply remained, his head tilted slightly, eyes resting on the wooden door, the same one Jack had opened so many winters ago. He stayed for hours, watching, breathing, remembering. No one dared approach. It felt wrong to disturb it, this ancient right between two souls who had crossed species and silence to understand each other. When the moon rose high and the wind calmed, Bruno stood slowly, turned, and walked back into the forest. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The bond they shared was not bound to time or distance. It was imprinted on the earth itself, in claw marks and footprints, in chain links broken, in cubs rescued, in acts of mercy and trust. In the weeks that followed, Claire wrote one final piece. She called it The Final Visit. It spoke of friendship and wilderness, of grief and gratitude, of a man who found redemption not in crowds or causes, but in a single act of kindness. The article closed with a line Jack had once said to her, almost offhand, years ago, while feeding a wounded owl, sometimes, if you're very quiet and very patient, the wild will trust you enough to let you see its heart. That quote was carved into the wooden archway at the entrance of Whitaker's refuge. The sanctuary continued. Children still came. Still healed, volunteers walked the same trails Jack once did, and in the quiet moments when the wind moved just right through the trees, it felt like he was still there, watching, guiding, reminding them what it meant to coexist. His cabin remained untouched, preserved as he left it. Visitors sometimes left stones on the porch, or feathers, or small carved animals, tokens of respect on the edge of the property where the forest thickened and the human path ended. A single stone stood engraved with a simple epitaph, Jack Whitaker, friend of the wild. He listened. He belonged. And somewhere in the deep hush of the American wilderness, a bear named Bruno moved through the trees, carrying with him the memory of a man who had looked past fear, past instinct, past the divide between species, and chosen instead to act with compassion. Their story became legend, not just one of survival, but of transformation, a reminder that even the wildest hearts can be reached and that the quietest voices can echo the loudest if only someone is willing to hear them. Let me know if you would like a compiled version, formatting help, or even illustrations or a cover concept. Years passed like the gentle shifting of leaves in an endless forest, and yet the memory of Jack Whitaker remained rooted deeper than any tree. Within Whitaker's refuge, the sanctuary had not only endured, it had flourished. What began as a few shelters built by calloused hands and quiet intentions had grown into a living monument, a place where the wild and the human world met, not in conflict but in kinship. The wooden arch bearing Jack's words welcomed thousands now, hikers with muddy boots, children with notebooks in hand, weary travelers seeking something they couldn't name. Scientists came to study. Poets came to write. Artists came to feel. and all of them left with a piece of Jack's legacy stitched quietly into their hearts. The cabin remained untouched, preserved exactly as he'd left it. His coat still hung by the door. His journal sat on the table beside a coffee mug, its contents read only once by Claire Morgan, then closed forever. No one touched his things. It was an unspoken law among the staff and visitors alike. This space belonged not to memory alone, but to presence. To sit in Jack's chair was not to mourn but to remember how to be still. Claire had returned more permanently, splitting her life between the city and the edge of the forest. Her articles had given the refuge visibility, but it was her devotion that gave it breath. She led programs now, teaching children about ecosystems and empathy. And every time she told the story of Jack and Bruno, her voice softened just slightly, as though speaking directly into the wind in case some part of Jack was still listening. Tom Reynolds, older and grayer, still came by once a week, tools in hand, fixing what needed fixing without being asked. Emily ran the education center full-time, turning her early childhood lessons into a full curriculum rooted in respect and observation. Walter, though mostly retired, left a thermos of cider at the gate every Friday, an old habit that no one dared interrupt. Together, they kept the rhythm Jack had started. But even among all the life that buzzed and flourished, one question had begun to settle like fog among the trees: where had Bruno gone? The last sighting had been the night Jack died, when the bear appeared like a ghost from the past to sit vigil beneath the stars. Since then, there had been only whispers, shadowed figures glimpsed at dusk, bent saplings where none should have been, the scent of pine and something ancient carried on the breeze. But no one saw him again, not clearly. And as the years passed, even the most hopeful began to wonder if perhaps Bruno had returned to the earth the way all wild things eventually do. Claire never stopped watching. Sometimes, at twilight, she stood by the cabin's porch, hand resting on the old rail Jack had carved, scanning the treeline as the sky burned orange and pink. She never spoke his name aloud, she simply waited, listening to the wind, the rustle of branches, the whisper of memory. One particularly cold autumn evening, 10 years to the day since Jack's death, the refuge held a commemorative gathering. Candles were lit along the paths. Visitors and locals alike gathered near the clearing where Jack's memorial stone stood. Claire spoke briefly, reading a passage from Jack's journal, the only one she had ever shared. "I once believed the wild was something to protect from us, but I've come to see it differently. The wild isn't separate, it's within us. We just forget how to hear it." After the reading, the group dispersed, some wandering the trails, others leaving quiet offerings on the porch: stones, feathers, carved animals, all tokens of remembrance. That night, as frost began to coat the leaves and the moon climbed through a halo of silver clouds, Claire found herself unable to sleep. Something restless stirred in her, an old instinct she couldn't name. She wrapped herself in a blanket and stepped onto the porch of Jack's cabin, sipping from a steaming mug. The forest was quieter than usual, no wind, no owls, just stillness. She stood for a long time, breathing it in, heart steady, mind open. And then she saw it. From the darkness beneath the trees, a figure emerged, not loud, not sudden, but with the certainty of something returning to where it belonged. Bruno. His fur was grizzled now, touched by the years. His steps were slower, heavier, but his eyes, those eyes, were the same, deep knowing. He stepped into the clearing, the moon casting his shadow long across the earth. He made no sound. He didn't need to. Claire didn't move. She watched as Bruno approached the porch, stopped a few feet away, and looked at the door of the cabin, the same door Jack had opened. So many winters ago, Bruno sat. His breath came slow, clouding in the air, and his gaze never wavered. The silence stretched between them like a thread pulled taut across time, and then something astonishing happened. From the edge of the woods came two more shapes, smaller, younger, cautious bears, cubs, but not helpless ones, adolescents, strong and curious. They paused, as if unsure, then padded slowly toward Bruno, sitting beside him. Claire's eyes blurred with tears. A new generation, Bruno's lineage, Jack's legacy. She didn't dare speak. She didn't want to break whatever spell had settled over the clearing. Bruno turned slightly toward her, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment it was as if the years folded in on themselves, collapsing the past and present into a single heartbeat. It wasn't goodbye. It wasn't hello. It was something deeper, a knowing, a passing of something wordless between them. They stayed until just before dawn, then rose slowly and returned to the forest, vanishing without sound, leaving behind only the gentle imprint of their paws in the dew-covered earth. Claire didn't follow. She stood there until the sun rose and the morning birds began to sing again, and in that moment, she felt something settle inside her. Not an ending, but a continuation, a circle unbroken. In the years that followed, the story of Jack and Bruno became more than just a legend. It became part of the soul of the place. Artists painted murals of their first meeting. Children acted out the story in school plays. The trail leading to the old lodge, now overgrown, was renamed the Chain Path, a reminder of what had been broken. Every year, on the anniversary of Jack's passing, a candle was placed on the porch, just one, flickering gently in the night, waiting for the forest to come and remember. The wild had not forgotten Jack Whittaker, and neither had the world. His voice, never loud, continued to echo through every rustle of leaves, every rescued animal, every quiet moment when a person chose to listen instead of speak, to help instead of fear. He had taught them that the line between human and beast was not one of dominance or distance, but of understanding, and in doing so, he had not only saved a bear, he had reminded the world how to belong to the wild.